Okay, I wanted to use this video to outline what a local authority was and why it was that we were going through this process where these duties have emerged in the 20th century that now need to be consolidated at a national level. And I thought the best duty to use to describe it was duties to look after children. So local authorities are established, but they don't function the same way as a centrally planned institution. There isn't a policymaker at the centre and then a national hierarchy of institutions where they can affect change over a country. These are kind of a collection of duties and legal responsibilities contained on the ground in a local area linked to democratic responsibility. Also to courts. Many of these duties are overseen by our justice system or overseen by our courts. So duties to children is one such thing. The local authority provides institutions around the legal responsibilities. The legal responsibilities are upheld by the courts. And then, do you know what I mean? So it's not actually like a set bunch of tensions. It's not like somebody sets up an office and then blah, blah, blah. This is actually a bunch of tensions that emerge. So before 1945, it was kind of like charity and, you know, the poor could look to a liberal class for pity, but what they often found was abuse. And we kind of see, I tell you what's really interesting, the reaction that Hayek got when he addressed Road to Serfdom to socialists, that's the reaction that means we need the welfare state, because people react violently and abusively to good intentions being questioned. And so within local authorities, these other services kind of emerged. Now, we had big centrally planned institutions like education and health and a housing system and a cash transfer system, which all of a sudden were meeting around families so that a baseline could be met. And, you know, when the NHS started, there were women queuing up outside GP surgeries with prolapses tucked into their knickers because they hadn't had healthcare, because they had been bottom of the list in their own families for so long that they'd been walking around with fucking prolapses in their knickers for months and years. And, you know, all of a sudden, what we'd learned about in the Second World War about the state of kids, about poverty with children through evacuation, because really, and also about child abuse through evacuation. We learned quite a lot about child abuse through evacuation. And we kind of came out of the Second World War and we'd established these institutions, these local authorities in each person's area. And so the duties that I'm concerned with kind of happened because these institutions were joined together around families, and particularly children. And then all these services at local authorities actually are, all the social worker still is somebody who can pull together all those strands on the occasions where they need to work together within the private domain of the family life to do this, or when they need to intervene in the family life. And these are very complex, you know, decisions, you know, and so one of the duties that emerged within local authorities was the recognition of the looked after child, and this happened in 1989. And what this did was it created the special status for children where the state had taken parental responsibility. The legislation's really, really excellent. It gives the state the same parental responsibility as parents, and the state can only share parental responsibility, so it has to meet it. And within it, we recognised for the first time that there were these children, and they weren't orphans, and they weren't and they had complex needs. And I was one of those children. I wasn't in care my whole life. I was only in care for different periods where my mum, you know, found it a bit difficult or where stuff was going on. But I was one of those children. And in fact, the Children's Act came in when I was 10. Now, it's kind of gone past the notice of most people because, well, these are very marginalised children. We're always the walking worst case scenario. We're the point at which the state has failed, at which the family has failed, at which society has failed. We're usually carrying, you know, before we start, we're carrying trauma and, you know, the normal that we will reproduce as we get older, we have to reflect on, because the normal that we will seek to reproduce is not normal and it's not okay and it's dangerous. You know, so we have to, so that's the starting point for our life. It's quite different. But actually what emerged within the duties is something rather interesting. And it's recognition that state intervention is harmful. And this is, within the legislation, we recognise that proceedings in of themselves are harmful. We have a principle called no order, which is if no order will do the same job as an order, then no order is to be made. We had to leave this alone. And one of the reasons that I have such an enhanced understanding of institutional functioning and the rule of law is that that rule of law is central to my identity. Like, quite literally, you can go and read the bit of legislation that's at the bit of my and I was basically given an identity where I was given a strong sense of where I am in the rule of law, a strong sense that I am of a generation where people don't have the right to hurt us or harm us, and that actually this responsibility, unlike other marginalised groups, this isn't like race, it isn't like gender, like sex, it isn't like, disability. You're not looking for increased representation for this group. You're looking to minimise this population. Because this is where we have to reflect on the fact that state intervention is harmful and it does damage. And, my perspective is hyper-developed around institutions. But, a 17-year-old should not be reading Keynes and Hayek to figure out, her life. That's not normal. It's a dysfunction. It's a distortion. So the reason that I understand these systems so well is a distortion, because these institutions are as much part of my identity as your family is part of yours, and I have a kinship connection that I actually feel to these children. And because I'm an actual product of this new thing, when, the state said to me in 2010, oh yeah, we can just rip you out of the rule of law, most of the processing that I've done of that to say, well, actually, is about the fact that I had to consider whether that was possible. And I had to consider whether that was possible while every fucking available institution was telling me, yes, it fucking is. And it wasn't. And it was only ever going to bring us to this point where we had to consolidate these duties. So, the looked after child is a very, very new thing, and it's a natural evolution in citizenship. It was not put there by policymakers, it was not put there by, a politician, it was not put there by public demand, it was put there as a response to crisis and failure, and institutional failure, in this case the Cleveland Inquiry. And what it created was a new bottom line for policymaking. So there is always a tension between us and debates about the deserving and the undeserving, because we're highly likely to be the undeserving. Our chances of avoiding domestic abuse in our life course are, I think it's like none. We have a very low chance of avoiding that. Our outcomes are extraordinarily bad. Even those of us that do well, our long-term poor mental health outcomes are astonishing. We end up in prison, sex work, every possible really nasty outcome that there is. We've all got a handful of them. And I'm 40 and I look round and I can see the people that I knew when I was a kid, and, we're a fucking graveyard. But this is a new duty that has evolved within local authorities. It's brand new. It's the first time the state has taken this seriously. And it can't be undone, because it's the product of major shifts that occurred in the 20th century, and it's the evolution of the rule of law. And all that's happening now is we have, actually my generation is the first generation of looked after children where we have the data over the course of a life, which is really useful. And we form an organic bottom line for policymakers, except they're not aware we exist. And they're not aware that the rule of law that created us exists. And most policymakers are just of the state intervention is bad and they don't know what this is. So the one function here, now when I say that we have to recognise here that state intervention is harmful, we do. Because it significantly impacts children and it's very, very harmful. So regardless of the political ideology of the day, regardless of the policymaker's belief, regardless of what climate, regardless of anything else, we retain a function around these children to reflect on the harm that bad policy is doing. And we do that regardless. And that's what I was trained to do. And because my focus on that is not given to me by a job but already existed, that's what I always do. Now, because these are brand new duties, local authorities were established, and then we didn't even know we would need these duties. We didn't even know these things would emerge. We didn't know that social care would emerge. We didn't know that child protection would emerge. We didn't know that the looked after child would come. These were the natural consequence of social change, of our institutional structure, of political change, and they happened. But they actually form part of the fabric of the rule of law. They are bound into. They're a legal responsibility, they're a political responsibility, and there is no way to break that. And what we have been trying to do over the last 30 years is erode institutions, in the hope that by eroding the institutions, by eroding local authorities, by keeping them at the bottom of the pile, the hope has been that we'll just undo this rule of law, I think. And certainly when I met the left, Owen Jones, Sonia Handal and Ellie Mayo-Hagan were absolutely clear. They wanted to return to a pre-45 norm where the poor auditioned to them for pity through Twitter, apparently. And we were doing away with this rule of law. That was never possible. And what's actually happening is that this is a brand new duty that emerged in very imperfect local authorities, that we have never ever had the chance to look at the way systems connect around these children. And these are the children where they are connected to political failure, to legal responsibility, and where we can see what policy failure looks like. And they provide an indelible record. But, what they also mean is that this is a responsibility that can't be abdicated. And we have to learn. And at the point in time where our belief system is changing, we're having to reevaluate the belief system that we shape our institutions around, the rule of law becomes evident. And these responsibilities are not going anywhere. So we're now going through the crisis, which reinforces to us that that is the case. But for looked after children, from my perspective, this was the first crisis in the 20th century where we could consolidate those duties, which we're going to. And that's going to happen regardless of anything I do. That's happening naturally. So these duties are actually, we need to review all the things that we've learned over the 20th century with these. We need to look at the institutional failure that we've got. And actually, we need to look at what it was, because actually, these duties could not be contained within local authorities alone. The Children's Act gives parental responsibility to the Crown. And the local authority is supposed to enact it. No normal parent is allowed to put their fucking kids in the back of a fucking cupboard and say, well, they're our bottom priority. Parents aren't allowed to do that, and the state is not either, and that's what we've just done. And that's because instead of being able to see the importance of these duties, these legal frameworks, we've been focusing on eroding local authorities in the hope we can get rid of them. We can't. We're now in the period where we consolidate them. So for me, this period was only ever about that consolidation. And when I realised we were in system failure in Keighley, I knew, because these responsibilities couldn't be abdicated, that we were in the process whereby that would result in the consolidation of duties, which is why I've been kind of doing what I've been doing since then. And we are actually, and even with everything that the left have done to prevent that discussion, even with the abuse and the violence, we're still at the same point. They couldn't prevent that discussion. This is about the rule of law consolidating, and this is about actually, a major crisis where we have to look at these institutions. So the looked after child is a duty that emerged in local authorities that now has to be understood at a national level. And that's what I'm going to go through. I'm going to go through a few areas of law. I'm going to pay particular attention to social care, to capacity legislation, to housing, and to the other duties to children contained. But that's what local authorities are. And in order for us to get those duties to a national level, we have to go through this process of local authority failure too. So